Now, as we've been meeting for the last 3 days in this absolutely electrifying conference, we've been very conscious of the ghosts of Bretton Woods on our shoulders. Right now, I'm probably more conscious of the ghost of Larry Summers sitting on my shoulders and Adair Turner, because I know that we have a very tough act to follow tonight. Those of you who weren't around on Friday evening or Saturday evening missed a truly fantastic spectacle of the Larry and Martin cabaret act on Friday night, and then the Adair Turner virtuoso solo performance last night. But frankly, I can't think of two people who it would be better to finish the conference with, because in many ways, Paul Volcker and George Soros are not merely giants of 20th century finance and 21st century finance, but some of the most impressive giants of 20th century and 21st century finance. And their wisdom, their context, and their perspective is perhaps needed now more badly than ever before, at a time when many traders' concept of history is basically limited to the data points on a Bloomberg machine. So I'd like to start by asking them both to reflect for a moment on the reason why we're actually meeting in Bretton Woods, which is the question of global financial cooperation and coordination, or the lack of it. Paul, you were involved in a project recently called the Palais Royal project, which was looking at basically what's wrong with the international monetary system and what could be done to put it right. It's a document that had remarkably little attention. I actually read it quickly as I sat in one of the sessions earlier, and it's fascinating. I recommend it to all of you. It's also profoundly depressing because it points out very clearly what's wrong, and it offers a very sensible set of solutions about what could be done to fix it. And frankly, reading it, I had very little optimism that any of those suggestions would actually be adopted. Am I being too gloomy? I mean, when you look today...
I'm an expert at being engaged in depressing things. I appreciate the challenge that the previous speakers after dinner have posed, and I can't compete with Adair Turner and the clarity of his thinking and his rhetoric, but I decided I could get a red tie that was even redder than the one that he wore. But it's interesting because until this afternoon, I thought, here, all these people are meeting at Bretton Woods. Bretton Woods is known for international monetary reform. No other international monetary system has been named after a resort in New Hampshire, so far as I know. But there was no discussion of international monetary reform. Now, there was some this morning. And you say you read this little report, which is okay, and I am somebody who has tried to keep the candle of reform a little bit lit, but it's been a very weak candle for some years. But finally, for a peculiar fact, the system doesn't work very well, and Mr. Sarkozy wants to have a little leadership for the G20. There's been a little flicker of interest in international monetary reform. And it's interesting that you said you didn't come away with any feeling that anything was going to happen.
What is it?
Which reminds me of my introduction to this subject, more or less, not quite introduction. But I became Undersecretary of the Treasury for Monetary Affairs in 1969, 42 years ago. And the Undersecretary for Monetary Affairs in the U.S. Treasury at that point was the head of a committee to advise the president on international monetary reform. And the system was rather shaky, to say the least. We were kind of on the verge of a potential crisis. So we met rather intensely for a while to see whether we could devise something. There were all these ideas of sliding pegs and wider margins and partial convertibility, and what do we do about dollar, and so forth and so on. There was only one guy in the Treasury. This is a little interesting bit of history. One George Willis, who was the top civil servant on the international side, was the only person in the U.S. Treasury at that time who'd had any experience in international financial and monetary affairs since Bretton Woods, and he was at Bretton Woods. But for a decade or more after Bretton Woods, there was no problems from the standpoint of the United States. Everybody wanted dollars. We owned all the gold in the world. Gold was running in, not running out. There was nothing to worry about. And all the wisdom of the U.S. Treasury was in that one man, George Willis, who'd gotten on in age, and he was kind of a crusty old guy anyway. He was a typical civil servant, but I would adjourn these meetings and we would discuss what to do about the monetary system. And everybody had bright ideas and everybody would make comments and wasn't going very well. But whatever the proposal was at the end, I'd ask George, what do you think, George? And he would say, it won't work. Well, I finally got a little exasperated. I said, George, what will work? Nothing. And that's where we still are today, to see what anything works. But I think we have, I really think this monetary system, this lack of system that we have, has no discipline in it, characterized mainly by the huge deficits of the United States and a huge accumulation of dollars by China. I mean, who would ever sit down and think of designing a system that permitted China to get $3 trillion worth of reserves and for the United States to happily use all that money to run up housing prices and make a great, I think there really was a connection between the international monetary system loosely and the great financial crisis. And nobody, has had any interest until now. Finally, there's a little bit of interest. So we'll nurture this and see whether George Willis is right or not.
So turning to another George, where does this mean the world is now heading? If the chances of global monetary agreement are not high, where do you think this leaves us?
Well, I think Bretton Woods is really a wonderful venue to remind us how the world has changed. At the time of Bretton Woods, the United States was the undisputed victor and leader of the free world, and was engaged in creating an international monetary system, which was really designed. America, of course, was slightly more equal than the others, but nevertheless, it was a balanced and internationally based system. Today, the difference in American attitudes is particularly strong because there is a very strong political movement which is opposed to international cooperation. And anything that smells of cooperation is immediately debunked. Generally speaking, state interference is resented, and international interference with American sovereignty is even worse than interference by the American state. So that's a tremendous change. On the other hand, you've got an emerging leader, China, which doesn't yet want to accept the responsibility for leadership, and says we are still a developing world and developing country. We've got a lot of issues at home, and we can't afford to really be concerned with the global system. And yet, the global system can't afford to do without leadership. And of course, then you've got Europe that's preoccupied with its own problems. So this is a very bad environment for international cooperation. Actually, I think there's a little bit of hope because of the President Sarkozy, who has this French desire for something grand, a grand design, a grand design, and, you know, Descartesian, logical, new system.
And unworkable system.
Right. So
You think it's unworkable?
well, actually, I think that the only, let's say, opening, because what you really need is closer macroeconomic and macroprudential cooperation. That's really what is needed. And I think the special drawing rights do have at least the potential of providing an opening towards such a discussion, because it is something that the Chinese have asked for, that they are in favor of, and therefore it's a basis for discussion of opening up, because we now have basically two systems. You've got the international system, which is basically free movement of capital, the Washington consensus, which is now under duress, and then you've got the Chinese system, which is a two-tier currency, which with very strict capital controls, and how to reconcile these two systems is one of the unsolved problems of the present day.
But if you were back actively trading in the markets now, where would you be trading or expecting the next crisis to break? You know, if we have this system, if we're all looking to Sarkozy and SDRs as the global saviors, you know, I mean...
Well, I don't, you know, you've got, as I said earlier during the discussion, we've got a number of unsolved problems in the sense of excesses or discrepancies or irreconcilable situations, untenable in the long run. But they don't necessarily going to lead to a crisis. You are in this in-between period where you have neither solutions nor collapses, because the authorities, when it comes to a collapse, they will do something to buy time. So it's this what I call a number of far from equilibrium situations, which are neither going to be solved nor necessarily create a crisis. I mean, the one that is perhaps the most pressing is the one in Europe, because you know, the arrangements are supposed to buy time, but maybe that time will not be there. You know, with Iceland voting down the agreement, what will be the effect of that on Ireland? That could be a near-term problem. But on the whole, I don't think you're about to have a repetition of anything like the financial collapse we had in 2008.
Okay, so good news. George Soros is moderately cheerful.
No, I think that is good. I mean, Paul will, I think, agree that the regulatory issue has not been really addressed, and I think we have heard some very cogent and outspoken views on that. And but it doesn't mean that the next that there will be a repetition of a financial collapse.
Right.
I mean, just if I don't want this audience to go away with a different impression. George loves SDRs. He thinks SDRs have some promise. I don't. SDRs in itself, creating SDRs, is going to do nothing about this crisis. It's an artificial contraption. I mean, I was there at the birth. And it may have a part in a completely redesigned monetary system, but just creating a few SDRs for the sake of saying you created some SDRs does nothing. It doesn't do anything about the lack of discipline in the system, which is the heart of the problem. So I just want to record that I don't, and this little group that you talked about, you know, the Chinese and the French came in and said, SDRs are going to answer the problem. By the time we got finished with a couple of days, the report says, well, maybe someday the SDR may have some supplementary influence 5 years from now, which is about what?
Right. I mean, it's 10:15, so I don't think we should spend the rest of the half hour talking just about SDRs. But the last time I was on a podium like this was 2 weeks ago in Calgary at the Inter-American Development Bank meeting, which was a lot less fun because it was sleeting most of the time and half the Brazilians didn't turn up because it was so cold. But you could feel the tension in the air between, on the one hand, the Americans telling the Latin Americans, you have to get your house in order, it's basically your fault, and the Latin Americans saying, well, actually, you know, essentially America is weakening the dollar, you've got quantitative easing, this is creating a completely untenable situation for us. To what degree do you think American monetary policy right now is making the imbalance
Oh, well,
worse?
that's a very sensitive question to ask for an extraordinary ability who never comments on American monetary policy, which by God-given right is always perfect. But I do think, I mean, don't ask me right this minute. I'll make a comment about QE2 or whatever it is in a second if you want me to.
QE2 at the moment.
I'm willing to do that, but I mean, this business about American monetary policy as a source of all evil all over the world, I think is a little overgrown. I mean, all those dollars are not out there. It takes a buyer as well as a seller. And they're all out there because somebody's buying them, because they wanted to buy them in preference to something else. And why was there no discipline on the buying as well as no discipline on the selling? Now, whether this QE2 business, I don't like the nomenclature, why it had to be dressed up as QE2 for a definite time period for so much bought at a particular time, you know, made it sound like something more important than I think it is. They decided to buy some long-term bonds. That's fine. Nothing the reason. I mean, I go, you know, I'm sorry, I keep, you know, everything that happened 50 years ago. When I was first in the Federal Reserve bought long-term bonds routinely. Now, not in this volume. They didn't announce it 6 months in advance. They didn't say it was the Queen Mary. It was part of the normal. If they thought long-term bonds were under excessive pressure, they bought long-term bonds. I guess they occasionally sold them too. Now that dropped out after a big controversy, so that for years they did not. But these are exceptional circumstances, and if they thought it was helpful to buy long-term bonds, I think that's fine. I wish they didn't dress it up in all this nomenclature. But some of the stuff I read about the reactions of foreigners, that this is a deliberate plot by Mr. Bernanke to undercut the stability of exchange rates around the world, I would be very surprised if you see any minutes of the Open Market Committee that talked about plots to undermine exchange rates around the world. They were interested in you know, supporting the recovery of the U.S. economy, period.
Right. Do you expect to see more capital controls coming in going forward, or more financial protectionism as a result of whether you think it's down to U.S. monetary policy or other forces?
Well, certainly there's a big change by the IMF itself, recognizing that countries may have to protect themselves against hot money flows. and Brazil raised the premium and the currency went up. So therefore, I expect that there will be more. And I think we had a very good expose of the problem by the former finance minister of Chile, who explained that, that neither the US nor China is concerned with the, regards it as an externality, what the effect on the rest of the world is.
What would the United States do if they were terribly concerned about the externality with Chile or Venezuela or Thailand? What would they do? They tighten money in the United States? Is that what they're asking for? I mean, it's just, it's a, you know, it's a nonsense comment, it seems to me.
What would the United States do if they were concerned? I mean, what should they do if they were concerned about?
Well, look, the United States has been upbraiding China for undervaluing its currency. The Chinese have been upbraiding the United States for quantitative easing. And I think both of them are right, because both of those actions have negative influence on particularly on the other Asian countries and on the Brazil and Latin America. So the third world, if you like, and neither side is influenced by that. So that is the problem in the current situation, and it does create tensions. And China has benefited tremendously from having a two-tier system, as being the only one in a world of free capital flows. But if other countries are now forced to follow China's example, I think China will lose some of the advantage it has deprived from it. And at the same time, the other countries will lose a great deal, because by introducing these artificial walls, they will set up for avoidance, cheating, double invoicing, all kinds of other things that are very detrimental.
Yes. Well, if we can turn to another area where certainly the international landscape is challenged, namely financial reform, banking reform. We spoke yesterday after yesterday afternoon's remarkable session discussing banking reform. And I think you commented that you felt like you'd been in a revivalist meeting, where Simon Johnson and the others were saying, you know, I mean, a series of very strong statements, a real sense of disappointment, a real sense of anger, frankly. I mean, Anat was making some strong comments. It was a pretty heated session. Do you feel disappointed about what's happened in terms of financial reform?
Well, I feel more.
I mean, not just to the so-called Volcker rule.
After I heard all these radicals, I feel a little more disappointed that we shouldn't have been more aggressive. I hadn't felt so disappointed before that. I do think, I mean, this business is particularly the size of the banks and whether they should be broken up. I mean, I don't like these banks being as big as they are. I agree with that, but what do you do about it? I agreed. I don't even know where it quite stands. It's in the law someplace. That the banks in the United States can't get any bigger except by organic growth, which I think is preeminently desirable. But when you talk about breaking them up, I mean, to break them up, which would obviously be very disturbing, but to break them up to the point that the remaining units would be small enough so that you wouldn't worry about their failure, seems to me almost an impossible kind of challenge. We worried about, you know, in the Latin American debt crisis, it was mentioned earlier, there were 3 times as many banks then, and around the world, some multiple. But if any one of those banks, Morgan, Chase, Citi, Chemical, Manny, Bank of America, had failed at that point, we would have been damn worried about the effects on the market generally when they all were in trouble and strained capital positions. So I think this is an impossible kind of problem, and I don't like where we stand, but I also don't see how we can just slice them all up to the point that, apart from the political impossibility of doing it.
But when you look at, say, the Dodd-Frank reforms, when you look at Basel III, do you think that marks progress?
Well, I hope so. I'm not familiar enough with Basel III, but I know it's a problem. Just looking at it from outside, I was involved in Basel I, that crude, prehistoric approach toward bank capital, but actually it was fairly successful. The idea was to get bank capital up, and it was arbitrary and crude and all the rest. My impression with Basel II, with all these complaints that it was crude, we had to make it more sophisticated, went on for 10 years with a lot of, interaction with the banks, presumably a lot more sophisticated. After 10 years, nobody was very satisfied with it. It was installed just before the crisis and didn't seem to be any help at all. Now, did we learn from that lesson, and Basel III is really going to be tougher? I guess that's what it comes down to, tougher. And I haven't been involved, but I think that's been the effort. I also notice a lot of it doesn't go into effect for 3 or 4 years, which seems kind of a long lag, but you know that has been heavily lobbied by the banks, will continue to be heavily lobbied by the banks, and it's all administrative judgments. And unless there's another crisis or something, the temptation will always be to, ease it a little bit on this corner and ease it a little bit on that corner. So, I think it's important. I think it's central to banking reform, but I don't think it's the end. It's not a structural change in banking. Now, just having said we can't have a structural change of cutting down all the size of the banks, you can have some structural changes in derivatives, in proprietary trading, in hedge funds, and equity funds, and some changes that were not in the law. Never got around to it. Money market funds is my favorite reform. I don't think it makes much difference in the rest of the world, but it does in the United States. And that's not in the law. I wish it was, but I don't know if we'll ever get back to it. But there are other things that I wish was in the law, but I do think we need some structure. I'd like to see the banks much smaller, but I just don't know how to get them much smaller.
What did you make of Alan Greenspan's recent comments in the Financial Times suggesting that the direction of regulation was wrong? It was it was no longer a mea culpa, it was a kind of mea culpa retraction, if you like.
Well, I guess on the face of it, I can simply say without referring to Alan Greenspan, I think the market needed more regulation, and the banks needed more regulation.
And just one last thing on that, before I ask George his views. Is the Volcker rule, is it still there, do you think? I mean, are you disappointed when you look?
Well, it's a company.
Has it been watered down beyond any meaning? Or?
No, that's not true. I try to keep my eye on this a little bit. The law is about 3 times as long as it had to be, so it leads to a certain amount of confusion. But the law is pretty flat, saying thou shalt not do proprietary trading. And it says in a number of different guises, and the so-called SOC, when they reviewed it and kind of gave guidelines to the agencies, kept repeating the law says you can't do proprietary trading. Now, where it was loosened up a bit, which, typical legislation, literally 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, after I made the mistake of going to bed, they provided a so-called de minimis exception for investing in hedge funds and equity funds. There's a lot of constraints around it, so it's still a constraint, but it's a de minimis turned out to be not de maximis, but more more than what I would call de minimis.
Right.
But, you know, if there is intense lobbying going on right now as the agencies are finally, within the next month or so, they have to actually write the regulation. And I am told there's at least one agency that would like to see it less strict. I mean, less strict, what's it mean? They have to make some odd interpretations of the law, so I think it'll come out okay. One interesting about structural changes is a provision in American banking law. I don't know why it ever got in there, but it got in there. And a lot of people like it, a lot of banks like it, called merchant banking exception, where a bank can buy a company against the tradition in American banking under certain limited provisions. And there's some other law that some banking agency will be inclined to permit a bank to buy a company in some limited way. And one of the issues talk about is that proprietary trading. Well, I never imagined buying a company was proprietary trading. It may be proprietary, but it's not exactly trading. But why that provision remains in the banking law at all bothers me. It's another area where commercial banks should not be in the business of buying companies, it seems to me. But,
George, when you look at the state of financial reform, are you disappointed?
Well, I certainly consider that they have not addressed the problems correctly. I think that this whole effort to have living wills and resolution authority and so on is not convincing, because if you look at history, the authority's first job is to protect the system, and they are willing to impose market discipline at the periphery. But when the market is in danger of collapsing, then all bets are off. And since you never know what will cause that collapse, you're more likely to err on the side of reaching out and protecting even institutions that are not under your jurisdiction, then to take a chance. The one big exception, of course, is Lehman Brothers, which I think it was a really remarkable error of judgment on the part of Hank Paulson. Now, of course, he is claiming that the Fed didn't have the authority. But I think the Fed would, if he had wanted to, the Fed could have done it slightly, bending the rules, and then getting an exemption afterwards. And because
that's what you would have done.
What?
That's what you would have done.
No, that's what the Fed has done
Right.
on other occasions.
Right.
So look,
not on my watch.
it had, I mean,
Okay, so not on his watch, but otherwise.
I think Paul did a fantastic job in defending the system in '82, and but it started, I think, with the Bank of England bailing out the fringe banks over which it had no authority in I don't know when it was, 74. That was the first instance, and when long-term capital holdings got into difficulties, well, the head of the New York Fed got the various players in a room, and lo and behold, capital was put together.
Right.
So that's really the role of the authorities, and this is the tradition. So unless and until some major institution is subject to the living will, there will be no, it will have absolutely no conviction behind this. Right. This is really an excuse for not accepting the responsibility of having given an implicit guarantee, of ensuring that the guarantee will not be used. And that would require much stricter regulation. Go ahead.
I don't want to interrupt you. I mean, you're absolutely right about the tendency, you know, when the problem was on, you're afraid that the whole market, the temptation is to save them, and that's absolutely correct. But this law changes things. First of all, it's taken away explicitly any Federal Reserve authority for lending in these situations, just against the law, period. They did it before with 13.3, and 13.3, which was an emergency power, which has been taken away from them, explicitly. Now, they do have the authority, the FTC has the authority, to provide transitional help to pay off immediate obligations, but on the clear compulsion of the law that that institution will be liquidated, or it could be liquidated by merger either, and that the credit is there will be no government money put in that doesn't come out. Now, whether that works or not, it's a big question, and it won't work very well for a big institution if the European banks, UK doesn't have a similar provision, because how can you take care of an international institution, maybe headquartered in New York? I suppose it wasn't even headquartered in New York. How do you deal with it if the home country or the host country can't deal with it? But the hope is to get comparable legislation in Europe. And I don't know, I think the British thing is going to come up with a report tomorrow, I guess. I'd be surprised if they don't include that. But
in fact, today, I think,
if they don't, it's a big step backwards. But when you look at the situation practically, and you can say, you know, you don't believe it for the big banks, I understand that. When you talk about non-banks, there aren't all that many non-banks left. There's no Bear Stearns, there's no Lehman, there's no Merrill Lynch. There's Morgan Stanley. Do I think Morgan Stanley could be handled by this? Yes, I do. Do I think Goldman Sachs could be handled by this? Now, Goldman Sachs is still a bank. Maybe it shouldn't be, but it is.
I think yesterday in the banking debate, someone asked whether people could imagine if, Simon Johnson asked, who would believe that Goldman Sachs would be allowed to fail? Did your hand go up?
I put up my hand a little bit. You didn't see it.
For those of you who weren't there, the question of the audience at the time was, if Goldman Sachs was to run into trouble today, hands up who thinks it would be allowed to fail. So you had half a hand.
Well, I hope it would be allowed to fail, yeah. Well, first of all, it's a bank now. If it was a non-bank, and they are, you know, it's clear they're clinging to this banking license that they got in the middle of the crisis because they think they would be allowed to, they think the market would permit them to fail if they weren't a bank. Otherwise, why would they hang on to the bank and get all this additional regulation? So, you know, it's not proven, but I wouldn't be so sure that they're not.
But you take, for instance, one day after Lehman failed, the AIG was bailed out, which was reaching out to a company that was not under the Fed's authority. Nevertheless, it was essential, and so on. So I think the evidence is overwhelming that the first job of the authorities is to prevent a collapse, a market collapse, and everything else has to take second place.
We'll never prove this. I would think under the new law, with all these living wills, particularly if we had comparable legislation in Europe, AIG would have been handled differently. The government would have taken it over, and it would have been, the insurance companies would have been sold to other people, and the other stuff would have gone down the drain.
Yeah. Now, or we had Larry Summers here, who was very let's say, discreet, generally speaking. But when he was asked, well, you know, if push came to shove, would any company, any important company be allowed to fail? He said no. I mean, so as I say, as an erstwhile market participant, show me before I believe it.
So you wouldn't bet on people failing?
No, I would bet on.
But you would bet on another bailout.
I mean, this is the famous moral hazard.
Well,
and if anything, the moral hazard looms larger than ever before. And when you look at the situation in Europe, for instance, where the authorities are insisting on no renegotiation or restructuring of outstanding debt, because that could possibly provoke a financial a banking crisis. But introducing a collective action clause. So it means that we have bailed. This is at the present we bail out, but in the future we will bail in, which has absolutely no credibility.
Well, I know your position, and it is not unique in the market, but let me ask you a concrete question. Suppose tomorrow Goldman Sachs gave up their banking license. Would their funding cost stay the same, or would it go up, or would it go up a lot, or would it go up a little?
I'm sorry.
If Goldman Sachs were to give up its banking license tomorrow, what would happen to its funding cost? As an expression of whether you think that the moral hazard would increase or decrease?
Probably currently wouldn't go up very much, but it would go up.
I'd like to ask Paul a
question. So they're not 100% sure about your position.
I'd like to ask Paul a question, which is, given your experience with the Latin American crisis and a period of time when the banks were essentially allowed to grow their way out of the problem by not recognizing all the losses up front, when you look at what, say, Europe is doing today with its banks, say Germany, and compare it perhaps to the American experience, do you feel comforted to see the degree of forbearance or the degree to which the Europeans are amortizing their problems and trying to earn their way out? Or do you think that forbearance is making things worse?
I will have to plead guilty to feeling there are times when you want to exercise forbearance. And, you know, this came up slightly different form in this crisis with all the subprime mortgages and all the CDOs and stuff. I don't think there's any question that the religious marking that to markets that didn't exist aggravated the crisis. And that stuff, that is bad stuff by and large, but the prices today are substantially higher than the prices in the midst of the crisis. And if all that had been recognized and you say, oh my goodness, you're book insolvent, you would have had a hell of a mess. To what purpose? Now that's kind of a matter of judgment, but you can assume that in the midst of this kind of a panic and crisis, market prices may not be very accurate. Now, I assumed at the time of the Latin American debt crisis, I mean, you could have said, oh, well, my goodness, Mexico can't pay. First of all, you said, okay, you take a haircut. As soon as you said that, the haircuts would have to get bigger and bigger because the market would have marked it down further. And nobody would have lent to Mexico, which meant, in fact, they would have failed. Yeah. So, yeah, you kept it going, which I think was understood. I mean, we were completely open, as I remember it, as to what the exposure of the banks was, but they did not have to mark it down. So long as they continued to lend, we said, okay, that's a good loan for a while. Right. And I don't know what else. Well, that was quite different because and different in some respects. Then the banks were actually lending to the troubled countries, which is sort of what they're asking to do in Europe now.
Right. I'm conscious that the hour is late. We're almost out of time, but I'm also conscious that we have a number of people in the room who are also mini giants in finance or economics and would probably like to ask questions. Anyone wanting to lob some last questions before we wrap up? And just at the very end, before we wrap up, George, I would like to ask you just at the very end to say a brief word about where you see INET going in the future after this conference. But while you're thinking about that, let's take any questions. One over there.
So, Dolan Farmer from the South Institute. There was no discussion of, in the financial reform, I think the potential sleeper, hopeful thing in the Dodd-Frank bill is the Office of Financial Research, which, were it empowered by Obama appointing somebody who was actually willing to do something, could gather all the data we need so that we actually would have a picture of what the world's financial system looked like when we hit the next crisis. But of course, the Secretary of Treasury is reluctant to have somebody who could subvert his authority and go. Having all this data concentrated in one place is potentially dangerous. And I just would be curious to hear the views about that. Have you guys thought of that? And what can we do to get Obama to appoint somebody who will actually create the kind of sophisticated computer models that could actually revolutionize economics instead of just sort of patting the existing establishment on the head?
Okay, so do you like the OFR? Let's quickly get another couple of questions, and we can perhaps wrap them together. Got one over there, and then INET. Yeah.
The whole financial reform agenda, would you say it's true that it's driven primarily by crisis avoidance now? And if so, there seems to be an implicit assumption that were it not for the crisis and the various estimates of costs that have been associated with it, including opportunity costs, things were all right. And that is seriously questionable because not much of the misallocation that goes around with the financial system as we've had it for the past few decades necessarily ends up and blows up in your face and shows up as the cost of the crisis. So is it true that the real cost to the real economy of a financial system that is not doing its job is actually in peacetime and does not show up in the crisis, in which case we are missing the opportunity of a generation to actually bring in those longer-term reform agenda issues to make finance work for the real economy?
Okay, so have we miscounted the cost? We're going to end up being quite financial. And Anat, why don't you ask one question, and then if anyone's got a non-financial question.
You'll have to...
Yeah, this is one more. Actually, I have two quick questions. First of all,
Very, very short.
Okay. You sounded pretty pessimistic then about solving too big to fail. So I'd like you to opine on capital requirements together with some kind of increased liability for managers or some kind of a way to make people more responsible. And quick comment on derivatives, if you will. The Modernization Act, do you think it had anything to do with it? Legalizing certain contracts.
Okay. Well, with the three interlinked, let's take quickly here two more over there, and then I will.
I'm going to give you one from left field. Yemen, Libya, Egypt. We have three countries that are in a very big macroeconomic situation. There's probably going to be very serious humanitarian issues. The U.S. is probably missing a big opportunity to be advising these countries as far as where they're going forward, both on macroeconomic policy and democracy. And I would like your comments on that, because it looks like an opportunity that could change the Middle East for the next, from what it's been for the last 40 years, for 50 years going forward.
Okay. And I think there was one more, or we can, okay, last one. Yeah, then we will take them together.
I guess sort of a very broad question. Looking back over the crisis, was it primarily a problem of a lack of economic understanding or political will? Was it politics or economics?
With respect to what?
not anticipating and doing something about the drift towards crisis?
Political or economic, that I understood.
Yeah.
The
Okay.
others I couldn't make out, so you have to just
Okay, I will culturally translate them as an anthropologist. Maybe you should take the political will versus economics one if you'd like, and Libya. And maybe you can take derivatives and OFR and bank capital and counting the cost. That's quite a hefty chunk.
What about this appointment business, right? I want to say something about that.
Okay, you say whatever you like.
No, but I don't want to, maybe, the appointment business in the United States is terrible. It's broken, and that's not the only thing, but, you appoint, presidents don't get around to appointing people very quickly. They go through so many hoops, nobody wants to go through it. They go up there, they sit for months before the Congress, before they get confirmed, or they don't get confirmed. And good people are not in office the way they should be. I agree with that, but now if I may come back.
Do you think the OFR is a good idea?
Pardon me?
Is the OFR a good idea?
OFR.
The Office of Financial Reporting, or the data?
Oh, yes.
Research,
I do think that office is a good idea. But for you people who think there aren't any tough people there, the agency that's responsible for the resolution is the FDIC. And if you want a tough administrator, you get Miss Sheila Bear up here, and she'll tell you what will happen. Something fails on her watch. Your derivatives. I'm not a great expert on derivatives, but derivatives are being heavily lobbied. The general idea was to force as many of them as possible into an organized exchange and a clearinghouse. My impression is that's going to happen a lot less than the intent was at the time the law was passed, because the banks are putting up a big fight that they can't standardize them that much, and the clearinghouse is never strong enough to do it. And you do have to have a strong clearinghouse. You're going to do it through a clearinghouse. So that I'm not really very up to date on it, but I think that the full bore intent of the legislation may not be realized.
Derivatives, I'd like to say something about.
Please do.
Because I think that some derivatives are very dangerous, and they have not been properly dealt with at all. Since they have potential of destabilizing the market, I think they need to be actually authorized. The issuance has to be authorized the same way as the issuance of stock is authorized by the SEC. It ought to be authorized by the CFTC, and if you have a publicly traded derivative, that can be authorized as a class. If you have a tailor-made, individually designed derivative, that needs to be authorized individually. And since that is a very laborious process, this would set up a very strong incentive to tailor-make your requirements out of publicly traded derivatives. And that, I think, would bring the situation under control. But that's not what was done at all. So this is a failure of regulation. Already
another failure of regulation.
Another failure of regulation, which I think can be identified today, even though it's only going to cause problems in maybe only in 15 years' time.
You're talking about credit default swaps. You're talking about credit default swaps.
He's asked, are you talking about credit default swaps?
In particular, but you have got also knockout options, for instance.
I was going to tell a story about knockout. If you permit me.
Yes.
10 years ago or so, I was teaching at Princeton. I had a seminar, and I must say the members of the economics department showed no interest at all in my seminar. They were deep in
Were they
mathematics.
entitled knockout options?
They were deep in mathematical equations. But the students said, we want to see a real live speculator. And so George was kind enough to agree to come down and talk to them as a real live speculator.
Who, Rob Johnson?
And I got the economics department appeared then when George was coming, but I picked him up in the car to drive him down to Princeton. He came out, he was steaming when he came in the car. I said, what's the matter, George? He said, I just lost some money. There's something called a knockout option that I never heard of that cost me money. So we still have knockout options.
That's when I learned about knockout
Yeah, that's what he learned about knockout options. But it was an interesting, if I may say so, in terms of Institute for New Economic Thinking. You went down there, I'll never forget this, saying, George, now you explain to these economists what's going on here in the market. He started out saying, any of you economists that think there's something called equilibrium in the foreign exchange market, you're going to lose your shirts if you trade, because an equilibrium does not exist in these markets. And he explained how he saw the markets fluctuating with a mind of their own. And all those economists sat there, I don't know if they were awestruck, but they were struck. They didn't say anything.
Which kind of brings us to the theme of the weekend, essentially, which is, I mean, there's been a lot of talking, a lot of chest beating, a lot of wailing, a lot of concern expressed in the last few days, but also a lot of interesting new ideas and really a call for arms and a call for action. I'd like to ask you, Paul, what do you think something like INET should be doing now? And then ask George, what do you actually plan to do?
Well, the only reaction I had, I came here, I wasn't expecting so many people. I didn't realize it was going to be so big. And one of the first meetings was this revival meeting about killing the banks and getting rid of Godzilla and all that stuff. But
Godzilla, yeah, someone ought to trademark the term Godzilla.
No, but it struck me there were a variety of points that were raised that, you know, none of these things get fully resolved, but there are a lot of things where I don't know if it's possible that some of the research could be kind of better directed. It's not just free form of what somebody wants to do. I thought this was all very interesting, but in some cases, if somebody was able to organize a little task force, in effect, to deal with some of these issues that were raised and may or may not have an answer, it might be useful in just providing a little more organization to the effort.
George, Paul's suggesting maybe organizing a task force to try and actually consolidate some of the ideas that have been floating around and take them forward. I mean, what do you plan to do next with INET? And has anything actually surprised you this weekend?
Well, first of all, I'm not planning INET. I'm as much of a visitor as you are. But I agree that I think it would be very useful to set up, to figure out a few concrete issues and set up task forces to prepare some analysis of it, and then bring that analysis to the next meeting, because I think INET is one of the most successful initiatives that I've ever been involved with. The rival is the publish what you pay, which then turned into extractive industries transparency initiative, and has really made quite some remarkable inroads in dealing with the resource curse. That's, I would say these two are the most successful. But I think the easy part, in a way, is already accomplished, because I think that the monopoly of the prevailing paradigm is largely broken. I say largely because I don't think that the academic appointments have quite changed yet.
But it's a slightly sensitive subject for people in the room.
But I tell you why I'm saying it, because one of our initiatives is the INET Institute at Oxford. And Professor Henry, who is in charge, told me that both he and all the fellows whom he selected are getting their articles, their work published in the papers that count for, for the peer review and so on, for the appointments, and before they couldn't. So there is a breakthrough on the publications level. So I think the easy part of pointing out that the prevailing paradigm is flawed is largely behind us. So now comes the hard part of actually coming up with some new analyses and approaches. And I think I hope that the board will select a certain number of issues to be discussed and then more prepared presentation.
Right. Sorry, I misspoke there. I've clearly been reading too many Tea Party blogs. You're not actually out to change the world or remake the world for this, because of course you're not actually on the board, so I should have clarified that. Apologies. But that seems like quite an inspiring note on which to end. The hour is late. I'm conscious that today did start with a 7 a.m. meeting on complexity. So it just remains for me to say a very big thank you to both George and to Paul for sharing their thoughts. And before you all rush for the bar or for your bed, I think Rob is going to say a few words about how he is indeed engaged in a global conspiracy to remake the financial system.
I was quite inspired, having seen Larry Summers, Gordon Brown, Paul Volcker, George Soros, and Adair Turner speak many times. And I'll leave out your congressional testimony when I work for the banking committee, Paul. And I noticed in my own thinking that there was a little more kick in everybody's step in the lunches and dinners here. And one of the members of our group came up to me today and said, I haven't seen lunch and dinner speeches like that in a long time. And what came into my mind after he said that as I was walking back was a book by the psychologist named James Hillman. And it's called The Thought of the Heart and the Soul of the World. And the first part of that, the thought of the heart, it made me think that in this group, in this community, there is some kind of fortification that is building that frees that part that we might call imagination. And I think that that's an essential dimension. And George, you might well be right that that's been accomplished or seeing evidence at a meeting like this. And the hard part is still before us. But I don't watch Western movies, and I don't much believe in heroes. And I do believe that when Dorothy said, "You're a very bad man," and the wizard looked back and said, "No, I'm a very good man. I'm just a bad wizard." That economists have been very bad wizards in recent years. And while I flubbed the technology to start this conference, I wanted to bring forward that poem of T.S. Eliot about the hollow men, the stuffed men, because I think there has been a timidity, and I think a large portion of the American middle class is living through a social death. And they tend not to think of us as experts, they tend to think of us as executioners. And I think that that has to change. And I don't think it's comfortable to huddle with other experts when these people are in so much pain. And the hollow men, in my view, are the timid men and women. And then I look at the kind of chaotic conditions that we see. I look at the ways in which people have tried to demonize George and others and expertise. And I think that there is now a danger. There is another danger on the other side of this boat, which is that of false resolution. We experienced the false resolution of allegedly stable, unfettered free markets, and we experience the romance that government always will take care of market imperfections. And in this conference, we've explored in an international context the illusion of control and the difficulties of actual governance. And it may have seemed a bit chaotic, but I did feel there was a theme there. And I guess what I would say right now is we've built the platform over 2 years. And in my, how would I say, gratification for my work, it came from seeing all of your eyes and your enthusiasm and the vitality of these speakers. And I want to thank you all for making my life and my work satisfying. Quickly, I'd just like to thank a number of people. Obviously, George, Jim Balsillie, our leading sponsors, the McCater Foundation that I spoke about earlier, the Carnegie Foundation, the Sloan Foundation, and Paul Volcker, David Rockefeller, Malcolm Weiner. We've had a great deal of support, and it's building both intellectual and financial. I also just briefly want to remember Tommaso Padoa-Schioppa, who this time last year on this evening gave a very nice talk, who did very interesting work on international monetary reform. And when I speak about the challenge of the angry middle class in the United States, I want to remind you that Tommaso said to us last year, there are 3 types of sustainability. Resource sustainability, like we explored at lunch, financial sustainability, which we've talked about at great length, but he talked about social sustainability. And he was drawing that into focus last year when he spoke to us. And in the last conversations that I had with him, about a month before he passed, he talked about, in particular in Europe, the threats to social sustainability. So I want to, how do I say, thank his memory. And then I'd like to thank Tom Burns from CG and my conference management team at Glow Media, Cheryl, Cecil, Fran, Indira, Nikki, the Four Corners Media Group. By the way, for those of you who decided to take a walk or a nap, this entire conference is going to be on video and available. Some of it's already up, but it will always be there for you to revisit. Notice I didn't tell you that until just now. I actually had to make the decision not to have it piped into all your rooms. I told you I value community. The Keating Public Relations Group, David and Sarah and Bill Fallon and Rick, you did a tremendous amount of work here, and thank you for that. Bob Kassane and his team at CCS, who work with us in our fundraising. Tom Ruskin, security. My heartbeat was about 8 beats a minute lower all weekend because you guys were here, and thank you very much for that. Thanks for all of your sophistication, and it was very helpful. The INET team, BJ Greenspan, who kind of keeps it all together. Nick Alpha, Doug Carmichael, Enno Schroeder, Lee Price, Lynette, who's back holding fort in New York, and finally Arjun and Arjun Jayadeva, Perry Merling, and Dan Nielsen. I guess I can't let you out of here with one more song, and it comes from where I come from in Detroit. So anyway, thank you all for being here. Thank you all for persevering.